Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and fellow sociologists. I am so delighted to be able to present this talk at the Second Congress of the East Asian Sociological Association at Pukyong National University in Busan, South Korea. And my title for today is What Blocks Climate Solutions? The Japanese Case. In other words, I'm concerned about what are the factors in society and politics that prevent nations around the world from enacting solutions to the climate change crisis that is occurring on our small planet that we all share, floating in the inky blackness of outer space. As you know, our planet is suffering from a global climate crisis with rising carbon dioxide emissions approaching 1.5 degrees centigrade of average global warming. And the Paris national commitments are insufficient and are not being met, so we're heading towards 2.6 degrees of warming by 2100. And already we're seeing intensifying disasters in terms of heat waves, floods, droughts, rising sea levels, and other catastrophes that are intensifying and even making some parts of our planet unlivable. We can see that the use of energy, which is the lifeblood of civilization, has been increasing, especially since the 1950s. And most of this is coming from fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. And when we burn these fossil fuels, they give off carbon dioxide, the massive quantities of which, going from these fossil fuels, are creating a blanket around our planet, which is causing it to retain more of the sun's heat. And there's been a changing responsibility for these emissions of carbon dioxide and other carbon gases that are doing this. The US is historically the most responsible for this condition, but currently East Asian emissions are massive. We can see here that around the 1950s, the US was by far the largest emitter of carbon dioxide. But now, in 1920, we see that China has become the largest single emitter of carbon dioxide, and other Asian countries are also have rapidly become very large emitters of carbon dioxide. So the burden of carbon dioxide emissions now has shifted to Asia, much of it being in East Asia. So this topic of carbon dioxide reduction has become very relevant to East Asia. As a planet, we have different possible greenhouse gas emissions pathways. Before the Paris 2015 agreements, we were heading to around 4 degrees, which would be utterly catastrophic for civilization. Here we are now, but if current policies were to be enacted, by 2100, we become closer to 3 degrees, which is still very catastrophic. If pledged emissions were cut, then we become closer to a little over 2 degrees. But to be safe and stabilize climate at not too much worse than it is presently, we need to make radical cuts and go down to 1.5 degrees. So how do we do that? What blocks the world from having these solutions? Well, in order to find that out, we started the KOMPON project. And KOMPON stands for Comparing Climate Change Policy Networks, but it also in Japanese means basis, or KOMPON. So it's a very basic type of research concerning our future on the planet Earth. And there's been great variation in national response in terms of reducing carbon emissions. And we use that as a sociological experiment to study what factors cause variation in national outcomes and what blocks climate solutions, the rapid emissions decrease. And we can see there are many potential factors that could be blocking different nations from making rapid reductions in their greenhouse gas emissions, their carbon emissions. And among those are economic, political, social, and cultural factors. And if we consider them in a little more detail, we could mention among economic, fossil fuel extraction industries induce government to maintain the energy regime, or owners, investors, managers, workers, or consumers demand short-term personal benefits from the existing energy regime, which may be fossil fuel, or higher costs and insufficiency or unreliable of alternatives like green energy inhibits the transition, which was the case some years ago, although it's not the case now. In terms of political factors, we could say, well, particular voting systems, political institutions prevent the election of Green Party representatives, or weakness of domestic civil society inhibits the mobilization of pro-environmental movements. And in terms of social, we could say the persistence of habitual practices causes rejection of change. And in cultural factors, the national culture rejects science, or the national culture rejects international influences, or the national culture climate science research institutes are weak, or beliefs of national interest motivate political elites to pursue rapid development based on fossil fuels. So there are these many different potential factors, and some will be present and some may be absent in any given national case to cause the blockage of their rapid climate change solution. So in the Compound project, we test the validity of these different explanations by case studies and cross-national comparison, and hopefully the results will contribute to positive change. Explanations will vary by case and region. In East Asian cases, we may expect the developmental state to be central in blocking climate change solutions, since it will be the most powerful actor. And so it might be the main explanation for climate policy outcomes. In the Compound project, we have different types of data collection. And in this talk, I want to focus on phase 2, the political networks, which is a network survey of 50 to 130 organizations engaged in national climate change politics. And they exchange information and they enter into collaboration with each other. And they exert influence and participate in politics and have different policy goals or attitudes towards the policies, out of which then comes the determination of their national policy outcomes. So this Compound project was started in 2007, although it had quite a bit of prior research that I had engaged in. And I started it in 2007, had many grants from national research agencies, and it's grown to include research teams in 26 countries. And we're open to new cases if any of you would like to participate. Here's some dots representing the different cases that are involved in the Compound project in one way or another. And in this talk, I'd like to examine a little more closely the Japan case that was done actually with a policy network survey 10 years before we officially started the Compound project. And I was involved in getting this started and helping it work out and collect data. And it concerned the 1997 Japan Kyoto Conference, when Japan held the Kyoto Conference. And Japan then promised 6% emissions reduction of its carbon dioxide emissions. But 13 years later, by 2010, its domestic emissions had risen slightly. So this is a case of policy failure. So it's perfect for our investigation in the Compound project, and we want to know, well, what blocks this policy from succeeding? And so why did it not succeed? This is an important case in understanding the general larger pattern of our failure so far to adequately reduce these emissions. In the Japan case methods, I have some complex or detailed notes here on how we carried it out, which I won't go into, but I can leave it for you to examine more closely if you look at this recording later on. So suffice it to say that there were two main networks that we measured, information exchange and supportive collaboration. And we measured the relative influence of different organizations in the policymaking process. This included 128 domestic Japanese organizations and 33 international organizations, but we only tried to survey the domestic organizations. So influence ranking is one way of figuring out who's in charge, which organizations have the most influence. And it's interesting that if you look at the ranking by all the respondents, it gives one ranking of influence. But when you look at subgroups like rankings by the 3 environmental agency bureaus, or by the 3 Ministry of Foreign Affairs bureaus, or by the 4 Ministry of International Trade and Industry bureaus, or by the 3 main business organizations, those rankings of influence differ quite a bit. I mean, for instance, when compared to ranking by all the respondents, the environmental agency was fairly close, but these correlations, although they're high by sociological standards, when you look in detail, they mean that the top organizations were sometimes quite different by the different groups. So there's a different perception of power that these different subgroups have that help us understand who's really influential in the policymaking process. So if we look at the supportive cooperation network of all 161 organizations, we find that while it's very complicated, and some people deride looking at these complex networks as spaghetti and meatballs kind of complexity, yet we can find some order or pattern to it. And here we find that the meaty organizations are very close to the business organizations in yellow, and the meaty organizations here are these blue squares. However, over here we have the environmental agency blue squares, and they're very close to the international agencies like the UN agencies, the IPCC and the United Nations Environmental Program. So we can see a fundamental division in the political sphere here. And outside here are the environmental citizens groups and the news media. So this just gives the code if you want to look at it later. If we look in detail at the top 25 organizations that are seen by all the respondents, we see that the UN agencies in light blue triangles here are very prominent and ring around the domestic policymaking actors. And in those domestic policymaking actors, the EA organizations 4 of them are present. Media organizations are only 2 or 3 are present, and business organizations 3 are present. And the ruling political party is also present. So we see that here, they all saw the policymaking process, surprisingly, as profoundly influenced by the UN agencies, particularly the IPCC and the United Nations Environmental Program, which housed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was an international stimulus to emissions reductions. So there's a tension here between these environmental agencies and the United Nations agencies on the one hand, and then METI and the business organizations on the other. Now, if we go to the next one, we see the view of politics from the standpoint of METI. And here we see quite a different standpoint, a different network. METI sees itself as at the very center of the policymaking process, with three METI organizations being seen as very influential and three business organizations. And the environmental agencies are reduced to two. So we see that METI actually has five with this one, sees itself in this connection to the business organizations which represent the electrical industry. For instance, this is the Federation of Electrical Power Companies of Japan. This is Japan Iron and Steel Federation, which uses tremendous amounts of electrical power. And this is the Japan Federation of Economic Organizations, or the well-known Keidanren. So we see a different configuration here of power. And this shows us that actually the policymaking process was dominated by the business organizations, the electrical company organizations in particular. So how could this happen when we expected a developmental state to be in control, and when the majority or total average saw tremendous influence from the environmental agencies and the international UN agencies? Well, there were a lot of factors among those we mentioned in Japan that would have led you to expect a positive outcome, a successful implementation of the 6% reductions. The national culture supported science, domestic scientific informations are strong, the Environmental Agency and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs supported setting an appreciable emissions reduction target. Japan may well at that time have decided to institute a carbon tax and considerably reduce its domestic emissions. But these countervailing factors failed to stop the dominant factors. So what were the dominant factors? Well, the regulatory capture of METI by the electric power industry. In other words, the electric power industry provided for retirement offices and jobs for retired METI officials in the famous descent from heaven, or Amakudari. And they rejected the contrary information. In other words, the electric power industry does not receive information from UNEP or IPCC. Ideological hegemony exercised by METI over other elites, that it knows best how to protect Japan's economic prosperity. And then elite misrecognition of the actual power structure due to elite belief in the dominant social imaginary of harmony, that politics operates through consensus. And that led the elites to think that the UN agencies were actually quite dominant in Japan's emissions reductions policies. At the same time, there was soft social control of civil society by various kinds of regulations that made civil society organizations and environmental climate change movements and such very weak. And so this led to a lack of sufficient criticism from civil society of Japan's policymaking process. Of course, at the same time, we can point to the higher cost of wind and solar at that time, and Japan's already significant energy conservation as objective factors that could also contribute to a lack of a willingness to transition to the green energy. At the same time, we can't place the predominance of the electrical industry as an inevitable factor. It was not inevitable. Its domination over policy outcomes at that juncture was promoted by an unpredictable contingency, the collapse due to unexpected scandal of prior support for emissions reductions within the ruling party, the Liberal Democratic Party. So, in conclusion, in this Japanese case, the developmental state was not a primary factor. To discover what blocks climate solutions in a given case, it shows we need multidimensional analysis of many potential factors. We need to account for precise meso-level analysis of the political process, and we need to take into account contingent events that may happen by chance, so that we can never say that all our factors determine the outcome in an absolute sense. We need to accumulate more case studies in this matter to better understand any general principles of the blockage. But certainly, we can conclude that the political power of the established energy regime is very likely to be a blocking factor in many cases. And particularly, it's surprising that the established energy regime, when it's administered by private market-based or capitalist companies, may have a very strong interest in blocking the transition to a green energy, carbon neutral power regime and energy regime that is so necessary in the future. So this just goes to show one method of analysis where we can start to analyze different cases and compare the factors that are leading to their success or failure in making the transition, as it's called, to a cleaner energy regime. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions about this if you write me by email. My email is broad001@umn.edu. So thanks very much, and I wish you a very fine rest of your conference. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I hope we can meet in the future.